I find one of the more interesting features of the Bible to be the way it depicts its many heroes. See, with nearly all of them that we know very much about, it doesn't just tell us the great and mighty things they did through God's work in their lives, but it also shows us their imperfections and their mistakes. Now, it doesn't have to do that. We believe the Bible's inspired by God, yet He wanted us to see these things of people's failures, their mistakes, and their imperfections. I've wondered why at times, as have you probably, but if all of our heroes of the faith were perfect people, that people that didn't make mistakes, people that had a perfect past, what hope would we have to be able to be used by God and do His work? We might feel like we could never measure up. I mean, think about the Bible. Where does it start? In Genesis, God creates heaven and earth in the beginning, makes a garden of paradise and puts a man and a woman in it. And the first thing we see them do is disobey God and then blame each other. Seems like the first real problem was them failing to take responsibility, saying it was the other person's fault. Really interesting way to start everything, isn't it? Oh, and we learn from it. We learn we need to take responsibility for our actions and for our past. But not much has changed. Everybody still likes to blame other people for their shortcomings. We all have failures. We all have shortcomings. And it seems that there's a tendency to blame your parents, blame your family, blame you're having problems at work, blame your boss. I mean, that's one of the things. Nothing's ever some people's fault, is it? And then we have Noah, the only righteous person out there, but as soon as he's off the ark, he's having a drunkenness issue, and wandering off unclothed. Next big hero of the faith is Abraham. He was afraid of Pharaoh and offering to share his wife with her. Very strange. Joseph, big thinker, liked to brag, was big into dream interpretation, and had a prison record. Moses, a modest and meek man, had a real temper that got the better of him a few times. Didn't want to do what God asked him to do, but asked God to pick somebody else. He had fled Egypt over a murder charge, yet one of the great heroes of our faith, David, maybe the most promising leader yet in the Bible if you're reading through it. Yet he not only had an affair with one of his soldiers' wives, but had him murdered so he could take her for himself. Yet was still called the man after God's own heart in the end. Solomon, all those wives. I mean, the Bible doesn't say that was a sin. You have to wonder, but having this great wisdom and having more than one wife, I just don't understand. He followed after other gods as well. Elijah collapsed under pressure, prone to depression. Hosea didn't seem to do too bad himself, but Well, most of us have a hard time getting past his wife's occupation. Jonah, God told him to do something and he did the opposite. God told him go to Nineveh, he quickly headed in the other direction. He became very angry and mad at God because God wasn't going to destroy a city, killing thousands of people. And then we have Paul. Paul, formerly known as Saul, murdered Stephen, one of the first deacons. Quite a past. And then we come to Peter. And I believe God puts these in here for a reason. Peter, in Luke chapter 22, Peter, as we just talked about, Jesus had said, one of you is going to betray me. And Peter said, not I. He told Jesus he'd fight for him and even die for him. And I think he was serious. Remember when Jesus was being arrested at night, Peter drew a sword and cut off the ear of the servant of the high priest. His name was Malchus. And we see Jesus picking the ear back up and putting it on, healing him. We wonder what. They didn't arrest Peter. They didn't arrest Peter for assaulting an officer. Kind of hard to make the charges stick if the ear's there and there's no injury. Hey, you're willing to draw the sword and fight with the soldiers coming to arrest him? Seems he was serious. Seems like he was willing to die. And as I mentioned too, being able to cut somebody's ear off, it's either some sort of astronomical winning the lottery kind of luck, or you're a master swordsman. One or the other. You decide which. And then Jesus is arrested and taken. Luke chapter 22, verse 54. Pick up where we left off. Then seizing him, they led him away to the house of the high priest. So they arrest Jesus at night, and they take him to the house of the high priest. Why there? Why not the temple? Well, it's the middle of the night. They were afraid to deal with Jesus in the temple because Jesus had the crowds with him. The people were following him. Jesus had, for all practical purposes, taken over the temple. He had more authority there than the high priest and the rest of them. It said that they wanted to arrest him there, but they were afraid because of the crowds. So now they're doing underhanded things and they're doing it in secret. They arrest him at night. They take him to the house of the high priest. So he's beginning to be questioned. It says Peter followed at a distance. And when some there had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat down with him. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him." But he denied it. "Woman, I don't know him," he said. Now remember, Jesus had said to Peter, "Before the rooster crows in the morning, you'll have denied me 3 times." It seemed that Peter could hardly believe it. An interesting thing in the text, this is in all 4 Gospels. This accounts in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But none of them say why Peter denied Jesus. I think we usually assume it's because he's scared. Was he afraid? I think most people assume he was afraid that he was going to be arrested and tried and crucified along with Jesus. Yet, I'm not sure if that fits or not. We don't really know. He said he was willing to follow Jesus even unto death. Was he afraid? It doesn't seem to be in character for him. He's impulsive. He's always the first to volunteer and step forward. He's always the first one with an answer, even though sometimes he gets it wrong when Jesus is asking the disciples questions. Well, let's consider he could have been afraid and thus preserving his own life. You see, I don't think God wanted him to be crucified along with Jesus. God's plan for him was to go and lead the church afterwards. Maybe he was afraid. After all, he was the only one to draw his sword and attack. The rest of the disciples didn't. Or was he disappointed in Jesus? Some have speculated he may have been disappointed in Jesus. Jesus could have fought back. Jesus had said to them, I'm going with you willingly. He said he could have asked the Father, who would have sent legions of angels to fight for him. Peter certainly would have believed that. But Jesus kept talking about his death, that he has to suffer and die. Earlier, Peter rebuked him for that. Peter rebuked Jesus. Hard to imagine Peter rebuking Jesus, yet he could have been a bit fed up, like, Jesus, you don't have to go with them. Jesus, you don't have to die. Why are you letting them do this to you? It might have made him angry. That's definitely a possibility. Or was he saying he didn't know Jesus? Some have said he might have been telling this white lie, so to speak, in order to try to find a way to rescue Jesus and bail him out. He might have been there looking for an opportunity to attack or jump in. Yet it says Peter followed at a distance. And then he's there sitting in the courtyard outside the house of the high priest. Ask yourselves, where were all the other disciples? Were they there with him? It seems as we read the account, it doesn't say for sure, but it seems that Peter was the only one that had the guts to follow him and to go there and to be with Jesus. That took nerve. That was risky. Was he spying and reporting back to the others? Did they scatter? Was Peter trying to do reconnaissance? Was he thinking about a rescue mission? Maybe. These are all possibilities. I'm trying to picture what this looked like. The house of the high priest, and there's a courtyard outside with a fire, and there's people sitting around the fire, and Peter sits down with them and joins them, thinking nobody's going to notice him. Must have been a few other people there, as they're having a fire there to keep warm. A servant girl recognizes him and says, "This man was with him." But he denied it. "Woman, I don't know him," he said. A little while later, someone else saw him and said, "You also were one of them." "Man, I am not," Peter replied. Peter uses man. One of the lexicons, when I was looking at this, said it was an expletive, can be used as an expletive, saying man. King James Version of this account in the other Gospels says that this Peter swore and cursed, saying, "I don't know him." Seems that it's getting on his nerves and getting under his skin. About an hour later, so first a servant girl asks him, then another asks him, and then about an hour after that, I mean, Peter, if he was afraid, he could have run off. He could have run off by now. He's sitting there a while, trying to see in the door. One of the accounts, as I was looking at this in Greek, it said that the keeper of the door. So you could assume Peter's trying to look in and see what's going on in there with Jesus. About an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly this fellow is with him, for he is a Galilean." How do they know? Maybe they've seen him. Maybe they've seen him with Jesus. Here he picks up that he's a Galilean. A lot of the time you know where somebody's from because of their accent, because of the way they talk. For he is a Galilean, that being from Galilee. Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. What do you think the look was? Anger, compassion, disappointment. We can only imagine. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. It seemed that in that moment, he remembered what Jesus had said, that you're going to deny me 3 times. Before the rooster crows. Peter must have forgotten it up to this point, not realizing what he was doing, just being caught up in the moment. But then Jesus looked straight at him, and that rooster crows, and he went outside and wept bitterly, realizing that he had failed Jesus right here. And then it says the men who were guarding Jesus began mocking and beating him. They blindfolded him and demanded, "Prophesy, who hit you?" And they said many other insulting things to him. Now this is just a picture of the worst of humanity. Jesus, who taught goodness and love, among other things, and never sinned, never made a mistake. They're playing a cruel game with him, blindfolding him and hitting him, saying, "Tell us who hit you if you're a prophet. Prophesy who hit you," saying many things, hurling insults at him. Now, what was wrong with these men? That were the men that were guarding him. They're bored. They're cruel. They've been up all night. The rooster crows at first light. They have nothing better to do than to beat Jesus. And then in Luke's gospel, as we go through it, we have Peter deny Jesus, Jesus be put on trial, Jesus crucified and resurrected, and then giving some final instructions to his disciples. We turn over to John to see the restoration of Peter. It'd be a shame if the story ends here and Peter just decides he's not a disciple anymore. He's let Jesus down and there's no redemption. No, he becomes a great leader in the early church, ultimately becoming bishop or overseer of the church in Rome. John 21 has the resurrected Jesus. John 21:15 tells the rest of the story. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, they have breakfast on the shore here. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. So Jesus hadn't really had a one-on-one with Peter or dealt with this since the denial of Jesus. Or not just one denial, the 3 denials of Jesus. And now Jesus is confronting him. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And there's a thing in the original languages here. There's different words for love. It's here, do you agape me? That's a godly, selfless love. A pure love. Peter, of course. Peter's probably wondering, why is Jesus asking me this? Oh, he's asking me this because I denied knowing him. He's making sure that I still love him. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to them, take care of my sheep. Now, as far as we know, Jesus didn't leave a pen of lambs behind. The sheep, and you probably all already know this, the sheep are his followers, his people. We are the sheep, he is the shepherd. So Jesus is saying to him, take care of my church, take care of my people, take care of my followers. The 3rd time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the 3rd time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Now, one thing we lose in translation here, we have that word for godly, perfect, abiding love. Do you agape me? Yes, you know that I agape you. And then he asks him that twice. And then the 3rd time, it's do you phileo me? Phileo, brotherly love. Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, easy to remember. But it's a lesser word. If I were doing the translation, it would be a little closer to this. Peter, do you love me? Yes, Lord, feed my sheep. Peter, do you love me? Yes, Lord, feed my sheep. Peter, do you even like me? That's more of how it reads. Like Peter, or brotherly love is more of a friendship. Peter, are we friends? Peter, do you love me? Yes. Peter, do you love me? Yes. Peter, are we even friends? Are we friends? And Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him a 3rd time. I think the hurt came from the change in language. Like, Jesus has already asked me this twice. If you keep asking somebody the same question over and over, it might be because you don't believe them. Or Peter, do you even like me? Peter, are we friends? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him a 3rd time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Why did Jesus ask him a 3rd time? Well, pretty simple. He denied him not once, not twice, but 3 times. Jesus is going to ask him, do you love me 3 times? Jesus was making a point. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. Now, Peter, in this passage in Luke, this paragraph seems like the focus shifts from Jesus to Peter. And then Peter becomes a very dominant leader in the early church. some in the Episcopalian, Catholic, Apostolic succession churches. Peter's the Bishop of Rome and the first Pope, with a long succession into the present day. Now, all four Gospels are sure to include this account of him denying Jesus and making this very embarrassing mistake. Gospel of Mark even has it. Gospel of Mark, tradition has that Mark was Peter's scribe and wrote the gospel as Peter dictated it to him, telling the story of Jesus. And Mark's the earliest gospel. So if you could call the Gospel of Mark the Gospel of Peter just as well, I suppose. And in that gospel, he puts this account. So Peter chooses to tell this, chooses to make it public. And they say that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source because some of the wording's exactly the same, yet went on to tell more of their own stories about Jesus. And all of it's God-breathed and moved and inspired by God to be in there. So if you could see that this preeminent apostle in here making this mistake, being forgiven and restored by Jesus, that gives the rest of us a whole lot of hope. We've all made mistakes. We've all done things we're not proud of. We all need God's forgiveness. Yet, this seems like a big deal to deny knowing Jesus when he's trained you all this time and he's done everything for Peter. Yet, it's in here to show us something. It's here to show us God's forgiveness. And that the principle to never think that God can't or won't use you because of something in your past that you're not proud of. Very, very encouraging here. I hope when you read your Bible, you can appreciate when it points out the flaws. As some say, it shows us our heroes, warts and all. You can appreciate why it's in there, to give us hope, to be able to be disciples of Jesus as well. Give us hope to be able to be used by God. That we don't have to be perfect people for God to do something with our lives. Jesus goes on in John, he says, "Feed my sheep." And then he says to Peter, "Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you're old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." What does that mean? Somebody else is going to dress you and lead you where you don't want to go? Is he in the nursing home? No, it says, verse 19, Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And then he said to him, "Follow me." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. 10 of the apostles were martyrs, killed for their faith. Now, that's important because there were people right after the resurrection of Jesus claiming the disciples, the Sanhedrin claimed the disciples stole his body. That was their story and they're sticking to it. Yet, the Sanhedrin were the ones that put Jesus on trial and had him crucified by the Romans. They made sure to have Roman guards posted to guard Jesus' tomb. If you failed in your guard duty as a Roman soldier in the Roman military, you were executed. We have historical documents from Roman history that say that. You let your prisoners go, they escape, you're executed. I mean, they didn't mess around. And the Sanhedrin had Jesus crucified. The Sanhedrin had Jesus' tomb guarded. The Sanhedrin took charge of Jesus' body. Joseph of Arimathea, that took Jesus' body and had it buried, was a member of the Sanhedrin. And then the Sanhedrin comes out and claimed Jesus' disciples stole his body somehow. And then they stick to that story, and then 10 of them are martyred for their faith. Judas goes off and hangs himself after betraying Jesus. John lives to a ripe old age. John's the only one to die of old age. Rest of them are put to death for saying Jesus rose from the dead. They paid for it with their lives. That's one way that's some strong evidence to say that the resurrection happened. So he's saying this to Peter to indicate what kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Peter was arrested and put on trial and ordered to be crucified in Rome. And yet he said he didn't feel worthy to die in the same manner as Jesus, so he asked that he be crucified upside down. So Peter was crucified upside down, bearing witness and sealing his testimony. Jesus was preparing him for that. And then he said to him, "Follow me." Here Peter is reinstated. He's confirmed again as a disciple of Jesus. Jesus gives him the commission, "Follow me." When Jesus first called Peter his disciple, same words, "Follow me, come be my disciple." It's the call of discipleship once again. Peter is restored by Jesus. Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. That's beloved disciple in John's gospel. That's the Apostle John. So Peter, James, and John are the inner circle. He looks at John and says, "Well, what about him?" Jesus tells him of the kind of death he's going to die, and Peter says, "What about him?" Well, Peter couldn't see the future, but if Peter gets to be crucified upside down, but John gets to live his life to a ripe old age, we would say that's not fair. It's not fair, is it? That seems to be what Peter was going for. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the Last Supper and said, "Lord, who is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he asked, "Lord, what about him?" Jesus answered, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me." Because of this, the rumor spread among the believers that this disciple would not die. But Jesus didn't say that he would not die. He only said, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you?" You know what that says to us? You know what Jesus was saying to Peter? You do what I called you to do. Don't worry about what everybody else is doing. And that comes over quite well to us. Kids are really good at this. Well, what about him? What about her? Snacks with fast kids. How come he got a barbecue chip bag and I got Cheetos? That's not fair. The barbecue chips have become the coveted snack. I told Debbie, and she went and bought a whole box of just barbecue chips. That seems to be what it is. But we see even when snacks are passed out, What about him? If you had kids, you know this when you assign chores. How come how come my brother or sister got an easier chore than I did? It's not fair. Kids, we do this as adults. How come she got the promotion and I didn't? How come he got a better office than me? You know, we do these. Jesus is saying, worry about what I asked you to do. Don't be comparing yourself to everybody else and worrying about what I asked them to do. See, in the Bible, God gives different people different jobs. In the New Testament, Paul explains it very well with spiritual gifts, saying God gives different people different gifts to be used to bless others in the community of believers and in the church. You use your gifts. The body needs all its parts to be able to function and work together. Don't worry about what somebody else got just because you want it. You worry about what I asked you to do. And that's all. Peter's restored. Boy, kind of a sad and hard story with Peter denying Jesus, yet it doesn't end there. We see at the end, Jesus forgives him, Jesus restores him, Jesus makes him a disciple again. Jesus' wish for him is feed my lambs, meaning take care of my people or take care of my church. That's what he had for Peter to do. Take care of my church, take care of my people, and don't worry about what John gets. We have to all take this to heart. Don't worry about somebody else's spiritual gifts, worry about your spiritual gift. Don't worry about what God's calling other people to, worry about what God calls you to do and expects you to do. Don't compare. Comparison's the root of all kinds of unhappiness. But between you and God, you know what God wants you to do, and do it. Simple as that. Now, as we end, I'd like to invite the worship team up for a final song. And as always, if you'd like to come forward for any prayer, I'll be at the front during the last song.